Welcome to week 3. I hope that the last 2 weeks have been profitable for you, and that you've taken a lot from learning about the fourth and third millennia in both the ancient Near Eastern region and then specifically also Egypt. So, as we move into the third week, we're also moving into the second millennium. And so, we're going to spend a few weeks on this very, very important time period, primarily because we have a lot of material, a lot of information about this time period from various sources, textual and archaeological, and also because this is a time period that does seem to correlate with at least the apparent setting of the patriarchal narratives. So, as the story of Genesis is written, we find that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob appear to have been, that their stories appear to have been set in the second millennium, ancient Near East. And so, as you read through this week and next week's material on the second millennium, I want you to ask yourself a few questions about the biblical text. Uh, do the two realities align? So, the history and cultural context of the second millennium, ancient Near East, and the apparent setting of the stories of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. So, does their nomadic lifestyle, the customs, the religious and cultic practices, do those align with what we know of the second millennium? And then, two, how might the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who obviously was in Egypt, how would those stories have been reliably transmitted or passed down to the Israelites? And then also, or kind of alternative question, do the stories in Genesis about the patriarchs, do they parallel the second millennium from what we know, or is it possible that they better reflect first millennium practices, which you haven't gotten to that portion of the course yet, but keep that in mind. Are they projections onto the second millennium of a first millennium reality? These are some questions that scholars have dealt with and have attempted to answer. This is also a time period, the second millennium, is a time period in which we encounter a number of changes politically, socially, and demographically. We see quite a bit of migration. For example, the Amorites migrate throughout the ancient Near East. Um, and we find a lot of changes, not only in the ancient Near East, but also in Egypt, which we'll encounter in the next week. Um, there's a lot of political struggle going on, as Liverani articulates. We begin to move into larger and larger political entities, and so we're done with kind of the city states. We're kind of moving into a regional state period, not quite to empires yet, but we do have this great powers club as the second millennium moves on, with Egypt, the Hatti, Babylonia, and then even some smaller states like Ugarit, which is along the Mediterranean coast in what is now modern day Syria. So a lot of political changes, and we're growing in terms of political force, military force, and things like that. Now you're going to be reading sections of Mark van der Merup's History of the Ancient Near East. You're also going to read 2 chapters from Hayes's Hidden Riches. One chapter on creation stories and another chapter on law collections. And obviously both of these both of these relate to Pentateuchal texts in Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy in particular. Now obviously the creation narratives and the legal texts in the Pentateuch are very, very important texts. And I want you to consider what the parallels that you'll be reading mean for your understanding, one, of what Scripture is, and then two, what type of theology can we derive from these texts, given the realities that you'll encounter regarding parallels and influence and things like that. You'll also be reading a number of letters from the city of Mari, which was located along the Euphrates River in what is now modern-day Syria. Really kind of close to what is now the modern-day border of Syria and Iraq. Now, Mari was a very prominent city in the early second millennium. According to the Sumerian King List, which is another ancient text that you encountered in the first video I posted, according to the King List, Mari was the 7th city to receive kingship. Now, the excavations on the city of Mari have resulted in thousands and thousands of cuneiform tablets. Many of them, or most of them, written in the Akkadian language. To give you some numbers, 9,000 of these have been published, of a total of at least 17,000 texts that have been found. So a true wealth of information from the second millennium. Now, again, the texts are in Akkadian. Many of the texts are letters, and so they're correspondence written between vassals and kings or rulers. The ruler there in Mari. There is also kind of family letters and kind of daily economic, social, religious texts. So I'm going to have you read some texts that relate to kingship from a resource called From the Mari Archives, which was recently published by a prominent scholar named Jack Sasson. And these letters give important insights into the political, religious, cultural, and social aspects of the ancient Near East, and particularly as we encounter them in and around the city of Mari. Now, the selection I'm going to have you read doesn't exhaust in any way the total kind of breadth of texts that one can find, and I encourage you to look at Sasson's book. There's also another translation of these letters in a publication called Letters to the King of Mari, or the Kings of Mari. So I encourage you, if you want to do extra research or extra reading on this, to look at those two sources. Now, there are many parallels from the second millennium ancient Near East to the Old Testament, as you'll find as you read the chapters from Hayes. We find law codes, treaties, mythology, and even customs, kind of daily practices, cult and ritual practices, oath swearing, and things like that seem to provide parallels to the Old Testament. Now, the one question that I want you guys to ask as you kind of work through the second millennium is, are these direct parallels or indirect parallels? Or I should say, do we find direct influence on the stories in the Old Testament, or indirect influence? Direct influence would be that there were actually people like the patriarchs that were out there who were influenced, who were second millennium people, and then those customs were passed down through tradition in some way into what we find now as the Old Testament. Or is there some type of direct influence, meaning these were kind of residual practices that were carried on in the first millennium and then were encountered by Israelites in the first millennium? And just ask, how would these texts have come to influence Israelites? And we find the first mention of the term Israel in a text found that's dated to about 1207 BC, called the Merneptah Stela, which is an Egyptian victory stela or victory monument dedicated to the deeds and exploits of the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah. So we don't find actually any reference to anything called Israel until much later in the second millennium. And then ask, what would have been the means of cultural and literary transmission between these apparent second millennium practices and what we then find in the Old Testament. Again, I hope you have a great week. I look forward to engaging you in discussion. Please let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.